Today, we are diving deep into a completely new story about depression. It's a story that takes us way beyond the headlines and into the hard science that's changing everything.
What if I told you that the story most of us have heard for our entire lives, the one about a chemical imbalance, just isn't the whole picture? What if the science has actually moved on? For 30 years, this idea that depression is all about low serotonin has been the go-to explanation. But a huge wave of new evidence is painting a much more complex and, frankly, a much more hopeful picture. And we're going to walk through that evidence right now. So where does this new story begin? Well, it starts with the evidence that really shattered the old foundation. A huge landmark review published a few years back really changed the game. Okay, so get this. Researchers Leah Zoller and Maura DuPont did a massive review. They didn't just look at a handful of studies, they pulled together and analyzed 54 separate investigations into the biology of depression.
And across all of those studies, they found something incredible. There were 744 genes that were consistently altered in the exact same way, in both the brains and the blood of people with depression. This was huge. It looked like a real, tangible biological signature.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. Those hundreds of genes weren't just a random collection. They all pointed toward or converged on just 5 key biological pathways. A super clear pattern started to emerge from all that noise.
But here is the absolute bombshell. Of those 5 pathways, the ones consistently found across all that data, do you know how many were related to the serotonin system? 0. None. The main pillar of the chemical imbalance theory. It just wasn't there. And look, this wasn't some fluke finding. It just powerfully confirms what the most comprehensive review on the serotonin theory ever concluded a few years ago. The verdict was crystal clear. The evidence just doesn't support the story we've been told. And this lines up perfectly with what we see in the clinical trial data. When you look at the info submitted to the FDA, antidepressants on average only beat a placebo by about 1.8 points on a 52-point scale. To put that in perspective, that difference is so small, it actually falls below the bar for what's considered clinically significant.
Okay, so if the old story is crumbling, what's the new one? If it's not serotonin, then what are these 5 pathways that the evidence keeps pointing to? Let's take a look.
Here they are. You've got neuroinflammation, that's inflammation in the brain. Then mitochondrial function, which is all about how our cells make and use energy. Neurodevelopment, how our brains grow and organize. Apoptosis, which sounds scary, but it's really about cell health and the brain's ability to adapt and change. And finally, transcriptional regulation, a fancy term for how our genes get switched on or off. And here's the kicker. Every single one of these is directly shaped by our environment and our life experiences.
This brings us to this absolutely crucial idea, epigenetics. This isn't about changing your DNA sequence. It's about changing how your genes are expressed. Think of your genes as a giant keyboard. Epigenetics is the musician deciding which keys to play. It's the physical mechanism that lets life, stress, food, relationships, therapy leave a real biological mark.
And this completely reframes how we see things. The biological changes we see in depression aren't some random disease. They are a biographical signature. I love this quote from a researcher who called it the molecular record of what has happened to the person, the body keeping molecular score. Your biology tells the story of your life.
So you can probably see the problem this creates, right? All this new, dynamic, environmental data, it just doesn't fit into our old, rigid diagnostic boxes. It's created a total crisis of categories for psychiatry.
This really demands a huge shift in thinking. We have to move away from a diagnosis, which basically asks, "What's wrong with you?" and slaps on a label. Instead, we need to move toward formulation, which asks what happened to you and builds a unique story, a context for that individual person. You treat the person, not just the label.
There's also a deep problem with how we even measure depression. There's this great analogy. To fill out a questionnaire, you have to step back and analyze your own feelings, right? But that act of analyzing it actually changes the feeling itself. It's like asking an animal, a kudu, to track its own footprints. The very act of looking for the tracks messes them up.
Okay, so this is where it all gets really exciting and hopeful. If the biology is different than we thought, then the treatments should be too. This new science points us toward real, tangible things we can do that target these actual biological pathways. Just look at this. Effect size is just a way to measure how well something works. The effect size for antidepressants is about 0.3. Now look at exercise, which directly impacts neuroinflammation and energy production. It's more than double that. And a modified Mediterranean diet, the effect size is nearly 4 times larger. These aren't just nice-to-have add-ons, they are dramatically more effective because they're hitting the right targets.
And what about talk therapy? This is so important. Psychotherapy is not a soft alternative. It is a direct biological treatment. We can now literally measure how different therapies go in and change gene expression. They literally rewrite that molecular score the body is keeping. Therapy is a biological intervention, full stop.
So what's the big idea that ties all of this together? From the molecules in our cells to the food we eat to the therapy we engage in, there's a new unifying principle for how we heal.
This insight is everything. The power isn't just in the pill or the diet plan or the specific therapy technique. Real, lasting change comes from the context, the field in which any of these things are happening.
To put it simply, the container is the catalyst. The environment of safety, of connection, of meaning, and support, that's what makes any intervention work. That's the core lesson of everything from epigenetics to psychedelic research. The context is what drives the change.
So here we are, the molecular data, the clinical trials, the new frameworks, they all point in this new, more empowering direction. The science has already made the jump. The real question left is for the rest of us. Can our healthcare systems, our institutions, and our culture adapt to what the evidence is so clearly telling us?